So today I wanted to go over something that I found to be particularly daunting, especially when I started off, which is editing. And I think a lot of people that start off with landscape photography struggle with this because from the very beginning, I think we have this notion that we have to develop a style for our photography, and editing plays a big part in that. And that's why it can be particularly daunting. It is a big part of landscape photography. Generally, when we shoot in RAW, the photos that are shown on display after shooting in RAW aren't necessarily what we saw in front of us. They just contain more information, and so editing is crucial to bring back a lot of the information, the vibrancy, and the feeling and emotion and stylistic part of our creative endeavor to create these photos. I think when starting off, the biggest things that I had to question were which software to use and which knobs to turn. There are so many sliders in software like Lightroom or Photoshop, and there's so many things that you can do with it that even the tutorials online feel a little bit overwhelming. So today I'll kind of go over the journey that I took while doing landscape photography editing. Specifically, I'll start off with some of the edits that I didn't really like and that now I'm looking at it, there is room for improvement, just like there usually is for any photos. I'm not going to be going over a lot of the settings or the composition details that went into taking those photos. There's always room for improvement there as well, and I'm not saying that the edits that I'm doing right now are necessarily perfect. I just think that they are a different way to edit and they might result in photos that I like more currently. So let's start off with this photo, and I took this photo I guess towards the beginning of my landscape photography journey. So what I was going for here was trying to capture these shrubs in the foreground and then this tree silhouette in the background with the sunset appearing behind the cloud cover. And so here you can see that I've pretty much cropped off the photo to exclude all the different lighting from the very top. And I've also made it so that I have, I guess, removed most of the color as well. So I've desaturated a lot of it. I have also added a little bit more vignetting to kind of highlight the foreground a little bit. But yeah, that's pretty much the standard editing that I had done when I first started. And so here we can see an edit that I applied recently to this photo. So with this, I've kind of gone back to using the color within the image, right? Although I could have gone with a silhouette, I think I did want to bring out a little bit more detail from the color of the sunset, and so I decided to go with that. I've also reduced the contrast a lot more and have made it so that I can still have some shadow and darkness within the shrubs to highlight their features. The vignetting is a little bit less because I find that recently vignetting too much with the photos can create unrealistic photos, and so I've taken some of that away as well. And then from here I've also removed this kind of distracting bush that I had in the composition. So let's talk about photo number 2 now. So this is a photo that I took with my telescopic lens, and as you can see here, it was pretty hazy because when you take a photo with a telescopic lens, you will get a lot of the haze that is compressed. Moving on to my first edit of the photo, I did crop it off a little bit here at the bottom, and I added a lot more contrast, as you can see. And I think that's something that I used to do a lot more, which is when I want to make something more vivid, I would just add a lot more contrast. I do like the trees in the back, but I really don't think the sharp contrast of the trees and the field is something that's very pleasing. I also don't think the sharp contrast over here near the actual farm is really pleasant to look at. So now looking at a recent edit that I applied to this photo, you can see that I've reduced the contrast a lot more. I've cropped it in a little bit more now, and I've also replaced some of the cooler light with a little bit more warmth in the tones. And I think for now it looks better just because it seems a little bit more simple, a little bit less high contrast image that I have on the left side, but obviously there are still room for improvements here as well. So moving on to a more recent image of mine, this is actually an image that I ended up printing. So I really enjoyed creating it, editing it, and then also printing it to see it in a larger format. Some of the edits that you can see probably here from the original is I've reduced a lot of the light from the green and reduced the saturation in the green at the top because I really didn't think that that was bringing the highlights of the light into play here. I also wanted to focus a little bit more on the rocks and not really on the edges, so I added a little bit more vignetting around the corner and highlighted the center area over here. And I think this is for me right now, I think it would have been a pretty good edit. So looking at a recent update I made to the edit, I don't necessarily think that it actually works better. I actually like the original edit more. And so you can see here that even now, when you think about re-editing and you start from scratch, your editing styles can change. And so here, I've reduced a lot more of the vignetting, similar to my previous photos, where I've realized that adding too much vignetting makes it a little bit more unrealistic. I've added a little bit more exposure back into the leaves over here and added a little bit more saturation. But most of those differences you can see is probably in this area right here, where I've reduced the contrast a little bit from the high contrast that I have in the first edit. I think I could add back a little bit more of the contrast here, add a little bit more vignetting, I think, to make it still realistic, but a little bit less than the original, and that could actually work pretty well. Now I'll kind of go over some of the edits that I think worked pretty well, and I don't really have any intention of changing them, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I think makes them work well. So this is a photo that I took recently at Acadia, and the original on the left versus the edit on the right, you can see the edit is a lot more vibrant. So I really wanted to showcase this individual down here with the silhouette, and I wanted to highlight that silhouette, which meant I needed to add a little bit more exposure back in to the highlights itself so that the silhouette would appear more vibrant. I also wanted to enhance the sky a little bit because it was at that moment very brilliant, filled with very different colors, and so just reducing the exposure down and reducing the highlights in the sky a little bit helped me with that. The foreground itself needed a little bit more extraction of the shadow, just because I think by itself the foreground in the original image doesn't really guide your eye down to the individual. So bringing back a little bit more of the shadows back to creating the path to the individual, I think worked really well for this photo. This is a photo that I took during my recent trip to Ricketts Glen in the fall, and it has actually become my screen wallpaper for my cell phone. And what I really liked about the photo is just the simplicity of it. So looking at the original photo, I really wanted to highlight the path leading into the forest, and I wanted to get rid of the distracting, blown out, I guess, background sky that you can see over here. So that meant in the edit that I would reduce some of the highlights there and create a little bit of slight vignetting to bring the gaze down a little bit and add a little bit more exposure to this part of the path so that the eye stays down here a little bit. I also added a little bit more exposure to the bottom of the path and add a little bit more contrast so that it becomes a little bit more vibrant and draws the eye to it so that the viewer can then work their way around the path itself. I did add a little bit more bluish tinge to the shadows in this area because I think the number of leaves and the light reflecting off of the leaves in a photo at least appears to create more orange than there actually was at that time. And so to bring that back, I added a little bit more blue to the entire photo. I also reduced the amount of green reflections and enhanced some of the orange that was coming out in the leaves, which was difficult to see in the original photo. I absolutely love taking this photo, and it's a photo that I had been waiting to take for a long time, really. Just a simple tree with the field allowing it to stand alone, but allowing the details for that tree to come out. So if you look at the original image, there is this tree over here, which kind of is a little bit more distracting, and I couldn't figure out a good way to remove that when I was composing. So in editing, I had to kind of get rid of that as well. I had to also bring up the exposure a lot just to kind of enhance the image because it seemed a little bit too dark here. The fall colors during blue light needed to be enhanced as well. So you can see here, there are a little bit more vibrant, but not too vibrant to distract away from the general simplicity of the actual location. I did dehaze a little bit and enhance the background to create a little bit more contrast with the fog. I didn't really do too much with the light because I didn't really want the light to be the highlighting factor of this photo. I think I really wanted to focus on the vibrancy of the fall colors and the simplicity of the image. So this photo was also taken at the same location as the last one, but here I really wanted to highlight the town, and I really enjoyed the fall color vibrancy at that time. I also decided to include the mountain in the back, but as you'll see later in the edit, I think it didn't really add too much, and I think I really wanted to enhance this area right here. So as you can see here in this cropped photo, I've only focused in on this part. So to create more of a hidden feeling where the trees kind of hide this gorgeous little town in the back, I brought up the dehaze and contrast for this area right here, and I really wanted to enhance the vibrancy of the fall colors that I saw at that time. And so I brought in a little bit more contrast and vibrancy and saturation to the colors over here. And beyond that, I actually didn't do too much editing for those because I think it really just needed that simple crop to kind of focus on this image right here, which goes to show that cropping can be a very, very powerful tool. So as you can see, hopefully, that the image that I showed not only showed my progression and different ways of thinking about editing, but they also meant that editing is very fluid throughout the photographer's journey. It can change, and that doesn't necessarily mean that a photo edit that you did previously is generally going to be worse. It just means that there are different ways to look at an image and different creative aspects of making a photo that come into play with editing. So now I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of, I guess, the concerns that I had when starting off with editing, which is considering the editing software to use. So when starting off, I didn't really want to pay the subscription fee for a pretty common software, which is Adobe Lightroom and Adobe Photoshop. So I started off with this free open source software called GIMP. But the difference between GIMP and Lightroom is that GIMP is much more like Adobe Photoshop. What's different between Adobe Photoshop and GIMP versus Lightroom is that Lightroom has non-destructive editing, whereas the other two have destructive editing. So I like to think of it this way. Basically, that non-destructive editing, you have the original photo and there is a database somewhere that keeps track of all the edits that you make on top of it. And so whenever the software loads up, it will take your photo and apply the edits for you to see on screen, but it doesn't actually change the photo itself. Whereas for destructive editing, I think the way I think about it is that the photo that you have, when you apply edits to it and you save and exit, you will usually then not be able to revert back to the original image, unless of course you save all the information before. But that's generally how I like to think about destructive editing, where you can't really go back and modify the image from where it was before. A couple months into landscape photography, when I decided to go for it a little bit more, I decided to switch over from GIMP to Lightroom, and I think Lightroom has been great. It is just so simple to use, and it allows me to be able to see the photos and create a workflow where I can see the photos on my phone or a different device instead of just my laptop. I think if I had to do it all over again, I think I would still start off with an open source software because I really didn't want to spend a lot of money starting off, and I didn't want to start creating subscriptions when I didn't know how long I would actually be doing it. But for those of you who do know that you're going into landscape photography and you want to stick with it, or any other type of photography, starting off with Lightroom and Photoshop works really well. Usually I'll spend 98% of the time editing photos in Lightroom. Rarely would I ever go to Photoshop unless I needed to do something a little bit more complicated, like combining different images for focus stacking and things like that. So what has helped me the most in editing my photos throughout my time? I think a lot of it is just experience, and I know that's difficult to hear because you really want the photos to appear similar or at least create the same effect that you get from seeing professional landscape photography. And the tough part is that you will have your editing experience change over time. Your style will change over time. And for that to progress, it really means that you need to actively explore the different features. So that means being open to trying different type of editing techniques. Usually you can download a bunch of different presets, but I think even with the presets, you still want to then edit the photo a little bit more to get it to where you want it to be. I have a mental model of how to actually go about editing, which is I'll first try to think a little bit about what I want to do with the picture before I just start moving sliders. But I think you still definitely want to explore moving as many sliders and turning as many knobs as possible, because that's kind of how you get a better intuition of what the different tools will allow you to do. Usually when I'm editing, I will drag the slider from one end to the other just to see what it does and how it changes the image, because I'm still learning at this point to figure out what I want that image to end up looking like. And I don't know how to get there unless I'm playing around a lot with the different tools and the different controls. I will say that going back and looking at your photos over and over again, as well as looking at other people's photos and wondering how they got to enhance some of the different features that you enjoy about those photos, definitely helps create this intuition for editing. And then you'll be able to go back to the photos to make minor tweaks and see the difference in the editing. And that's where I think non-destructive editing can come into play a lot more, because then you'll be able to go back and start from fresh if you wanted to. You don't necessarily have to then try and improve the edits on top of the edits you've already made. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you liked the different photos and editing techniques that I've learned to apply this past year in landscape photography. Obviously, it is a continuum of improvement that needs to happen, and likely will have different editing styles down the line as well. Who knows, a lot of these images might then resurface with different edits just because I found something else that I want to try, or I've realized that I had made a mistake before and I want to go back to it. All right, well, see you all next time. Bye.